There they stood, 5 massive shipping containers blocking my entire driveway like an impenetrable wall of rust and spite. The rain poured down my face as I stood there, suitcase in hand, completely locked out of my own home. I could not believe what I was seeing. 3 weeks of business travel, and I returned to find my property deliberately blockaded by the very people who were supposed to be maintaining neighborhood standards. Behind me, the taxi pulled away, leaving me alone in the downpour. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Karen, the HOA president herself. Perhaps now you will understand how things work in our community. I looked up at the security camera I had installed after the first warning signs. It had captured everything. What these petty tyrants did not realize was that I had been preparing for this moment. They had finally crossed the line that would lead to their downfall. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. I had been searching for the perfect investment property for nearly 2 years. The real estate market had become increasingly competitive, with good opportunities disappearing within days of listing. As a real estate investor focusing on residential rental properties, I needed something that would provide steady income while also serving as my personal residence. I wanted a place where I could build something meaningful. When my realtor called about a multi-acre property with several rental homes and a beautiful main house, I was immediately interested. The property was located in a well-established suburban neighborhood with excellent schools and amenities nearby. The previous owner had maintained the rental units well, and they were already occupied with long-term tenants who paid their rent on time. It seemed almost too good to be true. I drove out to see the property that same afternoon. The main house was a stunning 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and mature oak trees providing ample shade. The rental units were scattered throughout the property, each with its own distinct character, but all well-maintained. My realtor explained that the previous owner had owned the property for decades, but was now retiring and moving to Florida. During our tour, a woman approached us with a clipboard and a friendly smile. She introduced herself as Diane, a representative from the local homeowners association. She explained that while the main house and most of the property were technically exempt from HOA governance due to their location and historical status, the previous owner had always allowed the association to use part of the property for community events and storage. "We have always had such a good relationship with this property," Diane said, gesturing toward a gravel area near the back of the property. "The community shed is there, and we sometimes use that field for our summer picnic. We hope you will continue this neighborly tradition." I nodded politely, thinking it seemed reasonable enough. The property was large, and allowing the community some access seemed like a good way to establish positive relationships with the neighbors. My realtor mentioned that the HOA governed most of the surrounding homes, but confirmed that my property would be largely exempt from their rules due to its unique zoning status. After touring the entire property and reviewing all the financials, I made an offer that same day. The previous owner accepted, and within a month, I became the proud owner of what I believed would be my dream investment. The rental income would more than cover the mortgage while I renovated the main house to serve as my personal residence. The closing process went smoothly. I met with each of the existing tenants to introduce myself and assure them that I had no plans to increase their rent or make any significant changes to their homes. They all seemed relieved and welcoming. I also received a welcome basket from the HOA with their rule book, newsletter, and a handwritten note from the president welcoming me to the neighborhood. As I unpacked my belongings in the main house during that first week, I felt a sense of accomplishment and optimism. The property was even more beautiful than I had initially realized, with a small pond, walking trails, and flower gardens. I began making plans for renovations to the main house, drawing up designs for an updated kitchen and master bath. Everything seemed perfect. I had no idea that beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic community lay a complex web of entitlement and control that would soon turn my investment dream into a nightmare. The first few weeks in my new home were busy with planning and initial renovation work. I hired a local contractor to begin updating the main house while I continued to manage my other business interests. The rental properties were running smoothly, and I was gradually getting to know some of my neighbors. Most seemed friendly enough, though several made comments that struck me as odd at the time. "You bought the old Miller place. Good luck with the association," one neighbor said with a knowing look while we chatted over the fence. When I mentioned that my property was largely exempt from HOA regulations, he simply raised his eyebrows and walked away. At the time, I dismissed it as neighborhood gossip. About a month after moving in, I received the first HOA newsletter in my mailbox. The tone was immediately striking. Rather than community updates or friendly announcements, it was filled with stern warnings about compliance violations and the consequences of ignoring HOA directives. The language was threatening, with phrases like, "immediate action will be taken," and "fines will be levied without further notice" appearing throughout the document. Even more concerning was the list of recent violations that had resulted in fines. One homeowner had been penalized for having a basketball hoop visible from the street. Another had been cited for planting unapproved flowers in their garden. The violations seemed trivial, yet the penalties were substantial. I could not help but wonder what kind of community organization operated with such rigid control. That weekend I met Martin, the owner of the property adjacent to mine. He had lived in the neighborhood for over 15 years and had plenty to say about the homeowners association. "Watch out for Karen," he warned, lowering his voice despite us being alone in my backyard. "She took over as president 3 years ago and runs this place like her personal fiefdom. The previous board members all quit because they could not stand working with her." "Karen?" I asked, wondering if I had met her already. "Karen Westfield," Martin explained, "lives in the big blue house on Maple Street. She has nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood looking for violations, and she has a particular interest in your property." When I asked why, Martin explained that the HOA had been using portions of my property for years. The previous owner, elderly and conflict-averse, had allowed it initially as a gesture of goodwill, but over time the HOA had come to treat it as their right rather than a privilege. They store their maintenance equipment on your land, use your field for events, and some members even park their boats and RVs on that gravel area during off-seasons, all without paying a dime. This information concerned me, but I decided to observe the situation before taking any action. That decision was short-lived, however, when the construction crew arrived the following Monday to find they could not access the side entrance of the house because several vehicles were parked in the driveway. When the crew foreman asked the owners to move their vehicles, he was met with resistance and told that they had always parked there and had no intention of moving. I drove to the property immediately and found 3 large SUVs blocking access to the construction area. I approached the owners, who were standing nearby chatting, and politely explained that we needed access for construction vehicles. "This is HOA-approved parking," one woman stated firmly. "We have been parking here for years." "I understand that the previous owner may have allowed it," I said, "but this is private property and we need access for the construction work." The woman, who I would later learn was Karen Westfield herself, gave me a cold stare. "You might want to check your paperwork before making demands," she said. "This area has been designated for community use. I suggest you speak with the HOA board before causing problems." The confrontation ended with them reluctantly moving their vehicles, but the message was clear. The next day, I received a certified letter from the HOA citing me for multiple violations, including unauthorized construction, improper waste disposal, and violation of community aesthetic standards. The letter demanded immediate correction of these violations and threatened daily fines if they were not addressed within 72 hours. I was stunned. My property was supposed to be exempt from HOA governance, yet here they were attempting to enforce their rules. I spent that evening searching through my closing documents, property survey, and deed. Everything confirmed what I had been told during the purchase. The main house and most of the property were indeed exempt from HOA jurisdiction due to the property's historical status and location. The only portions subject to any HOA covenants were 2 small rental units at the very edge of the property that had been built after the HOA was established. Armed with this information, I felt confident that I could resolve the situation through proper documentation and clear communication. I had no idea how deeply entrenched the HOA's sense of entitlement had become, or how far they would go to maintain their control. The following morning, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, IK. EPT the tone professional, and included copies of the relevant property documents, survey maps, and the specific sections of the HOA covenant that confirmed the exempt status of my main property. I delivered the letter by certified mail and followed up with an email requesting a meeting to discuss the situation. 3 days later, I received a call from Karen Westfield herself, suggesting we meet at a local coffee shop to clear up any misunderstandings. I agreed, hoping for a reasonable discussion. I arrived at the coffee shop with a folder containing all my documentation, ready to present my case clearly and professionally. Karen was already seated at a corner table, dressed immaculately in a blue pantsuit with a pearl necklace. She smiled thinly as I approached, gesturing to the chair across from her. "So you are our new neighbor causing all the commotion," she said, her tone falsely pleasant. I introduced myself properly and thanked her for meeting with me. I opened my folder and began explaining the situation, pointing out the property boundaries and the specific exemptions noted in the documents. Karen barely glanced at the papers, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on the table. "Those papers may say whatever you want them to say," she interrupted, "but we have historical precedent on our side. The Miller family allowed community access to those areas for over 20 years. That establishes a legal easement that you cannot simply revoke." I explained that I had consulted with a real estate attorney who confirmed that no such easement had ever been recorded, and that informal permission could be revoked by the property owner at any time. Karen's expression hardened. "Let me be very clear," she said, leaning forward. "This community has certain standards and expectations. The HOA board is responsible for maintaining those standards. If you continue to be difficult, you will find living here very uncomfortable. We have ways of dealing with problem residents." The meeting ended shortly after, with Karen refusing to acknowledge my documentation or legal position. As I walked to my car, I felt a growing sense of unease. This was clearly not going to be resolved through reasonable discussion. The next day, I received notices of violations for all 5 of my rental properties, including the ones that were legitimately under HOA jurisdiction. The violations ranged from improper lawn maintenance to unauthorized window treatments and non-compliant mailbox design. Each violation carried a $100 daily fine until corrected. My tenants began calling, confused and concerned about the notices being left on their doors. Some reported HOA members photographing their homes and entering their yards without permission. One elderly tenant was so distressed by the aggressive inspection that she was considering moving out. I assured all of them that I would handle the situation and that they should not worry about the fines or notices. Concerned about the escalating harassment, I installed security cameras around my property, particularly focusing on the areas where HOA members had been trespassing. Within days, the cameras captured multiple instances of board members entering private property, placing violation notices, and in one disturbing case, actually measuring the height of a tenant's garden plants with a ruler. I also began a more thorough investigation into the HOA's operations. I requested financial records, meeting minutes, and membership information, all of which should have been available to property owners. The requests were denied or ignored, raising further suspicions about their practices. Through conversations with other disgruntled residents, I discovered something even more alarming. The HOA had been collecting fees for the maintenance and use of certain common areas that were actually located on my property. They had effectively been generating revenue from land they did not own, without the knowledge or consent of the previous owner, who had simply allowed them to use the space as a goodwill gesture. I consulted with my attorney again, who confirmed that the HOA's actions constituted trespassing and potentially fraudulent misrepresentation. She advised me to document everything, but warned that legal battles with HOAs could be lengthy and expensive, even when the property owner was clearly in the right. HOAs have been known to drain their reserve funds fighting these battles, she explained. They often count on individual homeowners giving up because they cannot match the association's resources or stomach the prolonged conflict. The situation continued to deteriorate over the next 2 weeks. My construction crew reported harassment and interference with their work. Violation notices appeared daily. My tenants were being pressured to report any activity on my part that might constitute a violation. The security cameras captured board members photographing my home at all hours and even approaching delivery people to question them about packages I received. I realized that this had gone beyond a simple property dispute. The HOA, or more specifically Karen Westfield, seemed determined to establish dominance and force me into compliance with their demands, regardless of legal property rights. What had begun as a misunderstanding had evolved into a full-scale campaign of intimidation and harassment, but they had seriously underestimated my resources, determination, and willingness to stand my ground. Little did they know, I had only just begun to investigate the true nature of our relationship. After 3 weeks of escalating conflicts with the HOA, I had to leave town for an important business trip that could not be postponed. The main house renovations were well underway, and I had instructed the construction team to continue work in my absence. I also hired a property management company to deal with any HOA interference while I was gone, giving them explicit instructions to document everything and contact my attorney if necessary. The business trip was productive but stressful, with the HOA situation constantly in the back of my mind. I tried to focus on my work, but each day brought new messages from my property manager about escalating harassment. Karen and her board members had begun issuing fines to the construction company directly, claiming they were violating noise ordinances and work hour restrictions that did not actually exist in any official capacity. As my return date approached, I felt a sense of relief that I would soon be able to handle the situation in person again. My flight landed late in the evening, and I took a taxi from the airport, exhausted from travel but eager to get home and assess the situation firsthand. The taxi driver seemed confused as we approached my property. "Are you sure this is the right address?" he asked, slowing down as we neared what should have been my driveway. I looked up from my phone and froze in disbelief. Where my driveway should have been was now a wall of corrugated metal. 5 massive shipping containers had been placed side by side, completely blocking all access to my property. The containers were industrial-sized, each at least 40 feet long, creating an impenetrable barrier that prevented any vehicle from entering the property. "What in the world?" I muttered, asking the driver to stop. I got out, still carrying my suitcase, and approached the blockade. The rain had just begun to fall, light at first but quickly intensifying as I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. The containers were placed with precision, their rusted exteriors gleaming dully in the streetlights. There was no way around them, no gap between them large enough for even a person to squeeze through. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Perhaps now you will understand how things work in our community." It was from Karen Westfield. The message confirmed what I already suspected. This was a deliberate action taken by the HOA to force my compliance. This was no longer about property disputes or petty violations. This was a declaration of war. I paid the taxi driver and asked him to wait while I assessed the situation. Walking around the perimeter of my property, I found that the shipping containers effectively blocked all vehicle access points. The only way onto my property was through a small pedestrian gate at the far end, nearly a quarter-mile walk from the main house. Rain soaked through my business clothes as I made this long walk, dragging my suitcase behind me. By the time I reached the main house, I was drenched and seething with anger. The construction work had clearly been halted, with tools and materials left under hasty weather protection. A notice had been taped to my front door, printed on official HOA letterhead. Due to repeated violations and failure to comply with community standards, the HOA board has been forced to take action to protect community interests. Temporary storage containers have been placed on community access roads as part of ongoing maintenance projects. We anticipate this situation will be resolved once outstanding violations have been addressed and appropriate fines paid in full. For questions, please contact the HOA office during regular business hours. I stood in my foyer, dripping water onto the floor, reading this absurd notice with growing disbelief. They had effectively imprisoned me on my own property, blocking all vehicle access under the laughable pretense of maintenance projects. My security cameras would have captured the entire operation. I went to my office immediately to review the footage. The security system had recorded everything. In the dead of night, a large truck had delivered the shipping containers one by one. Karen Westfield herself had been present, directing the placement of each container with obvious satisfaction. The footage clearly showed her pointing and gesturing, ensuring that the containers were positioned for maximum inconvenience, completely sealing off all access to my property. I tried calling Karen immediately, but my call went straight to voicemail. I left a message demanding the immediate removal of the containers and warning of legal consequences. I then called the HOA's official number and reached their answering service, which promised that someone would return my call during business hours the next day. Next, I called my attorney and described the situation. She was as shocked as I was. "What they have done is completely illegal," she assured me. "This goes beyond HOA overreach. This is criminal trespassing, potentially false imprisonment, and definitely harassment. We can get an emergency court order to have those containers removed." While waiting for my attorney to begin the legal process, I decided to do some more digging into the HOA's operations. Something about this situation felt off. The level of entitlement and audacity displayed by Karen and the board suggested a deeper issue than simply enforcing community standards. I pulled out the HOA membership directory I had obtained earlier and began cross-referencing names and addresses with property records. Most of the HOA board members lived in the newer section of the development, in homes that had been built within the last 10 years. I focused my research on these properties, looking for anything unusual in their ownership or financing. What I discovered left me stunned. Through a series of corporate entities and property management companies, I had inadvertently become the legal owner of every property occupied by the HOA board members, including Karen Westfield's home. When I purchased the Miller property, I had also acquired a holding company that owned these newer properties. The board members were not homeowners at all, they were my tenants. The previous owner had developed the newer section of the neighborhood through a separate LLC, retaining ownership while selling the homes on lease purchase agreements. The residents paid monthly mortgage payments that were actually rent payments to the LLC, which I now owned. They believed they were homeowners, but legally, they were long-term tenants with options to purchase that none had exercised. As I sat at my desk, surrounded by property records and legal documents, the rain continuing to pour outside, a plan began to form in my mind. The HOA had blocked my driveway with shipping containers, thinking they had all the power. They had no idea that I was actually their landlord, with all the legal rights that position entailed. The tables were about to turn in a way Karen Westfield could never have anticipated. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of rain still pattering against the windows. I had slept poorly, my mind racing with the implications of what I had discovered. The shipping containers remained in place, visible from my bedroom window like a monument to the HOA's arrogance. I knew that removing them would be a complex process, likely requiring court orders and enforcement officials. This would not be resolved quickly. My first order of business was to find alternative accommodation. Living on a property with no vehicle access was not feasible, especially with construction halted and supplies unable to be delivered. I called a local hotel and booked a suite for what I anticipated might be an extended stay. Then I packed enough clothes and necessities for several weeks, resigned to the long walk back to the road where I could call a taxi. As I trudged along the muddy path with my luggage, I noticed several neighbors watching from their windows. Some looked concerned, others curious, but none approached me. The community atmosphere Karen had cultivated was clearly one of caution and non-interference. I made a mental note of those who seemed sympathetic. They might become allies in the coming conflict. Once settled in my hotel suite, I transformed the space into a command center. I spread maps of the property across one wall, property records on another, and began assembling a timeline of events leading to the blockade. My attorney arrived that afternoon, accompanied by a real estate specialist and a private investigator I had worked with on previous business matters. "The situation is even more interesting than you initially described," my attorney said as she reviewed the documents I had compiled. "These lease purchase agreements are written in such a way that the residents believe they are homeowners, but legally they remain tenants until they exercise their purchase option. None have done so, which means they are all your tenants, subject to the terms of these agreements." The real estate specialist nodded in agreement. These contracts give the property owner, which is now you, significant authority. The HOA board members have actually violated several terms of their rental agreements by engaging in harassment and interfering. Why? Your use of the main property. We spent hours going through the legal implications and developing a strategy. The private investigator would gather additional evidence of HOA misconduct, documenting every violation and instance of harassment. My attorney would prepare both civil and criminal complaints against the board members individually and the HOA as an entity. The real estate specialist would review all the lease purchase agreements to confirm their legal status and identify any potential vulnerabilities in our position. What about the shipping containers? I asked. How quickly can we get them removed? We can file for an emergency injunction, my attorney explained, but these things take time, even in clear-cut cases like this. The court system moves slowly. We are looking at days, possibly weeks, before we can force their removal through legal channels. I considered this. The shipping containers were a problem, but they were also evidence of the HOA's overreach. Every day they remained in place was another day of documented harassment that would strengthen our legal case. Perhaps there was an advantage to patience in this situation. Let them stay for now, I decided. Each day those containers block my driveway is another nail in their legal coffin. Meanwhile, let us focus on the bigger picture. Over the next 2 weeks, we built our case methodically. The private investigator installed additional cameras around the property perimeter, capturing board members conducting unauthorized inspections and even attempting to enter my home through a back door when they thought no one was watching. We documented every violation notice, every harassing phone call, and every instance of interference with my tenants. Most importantly, we confirmed through county records and bank statements that the monthly payments made by the HOA board members were indeed flowing into accounts now owned by my company. They were unquestionably my tenants, making them subject to the terms of their lease agreements, which all prohibited harassment of other tenants or the property owner. As the end of the month approached, so did the date when rent payments were due. This would be the moment of truth, when the HOA board members would unknowingly be sending payments to the very person they were actively harassing. My attorney prepared formal notices of lease violations for each board member, along with eviction warnings that would be served at the appropriate moment. We also developed a comprehensive settlement offer that would allow board members to keep their homes if they resigned from the HOA, paid restitution for damages, and agreed to a complete restructuring of the community association. This would be presented as an alternative to eviction, giving them a face-saving way to back down from the conflict they had initiated. The final piece of our strategy was a community meeting. We reserved the local community center for an evening session where I would address all residents, reveal the truth about property ownership, and offer a new vision for the neighborhood, one based on mutual respect rather than intimidation and control. As these preparations were finalized, I continued to monitor the situation from my hotel. The shipping containers remained in place, a daily reminder of the HOA's hubris. Construction on my home was still halted, costing me thousands in delays and idle contractor fees, but I remained patient, knowing that justice would be served. The HOA believed they were teaching me a lesson about power. They had no idea what lesson they were about to learn themselves. The day of reckoning arrived with perfect weather, clear skies and mild temperatures that seemed at odds with the storm I was about to unleash. I had arranged for the community meeting to take place at 7:00 p.m., allowing time for most residents to attend after work. Notices had been sent to every household, describing it as an emergency community meeting regarding recent HOA actions. I knew Karen and her board would attend, if only to attempt to control the narrative. Earlier that day, I had met with a shipping container removal service, arranging for them to be on standby near my property. I also had a team of locksmiths ready to change locks on certain properties if necessary. Every detail had been meticulously planned. I arrived at the community center an hour early to set up. My attorney and the real estate specialist were already there, arranging documents and preparing the audiovisual equipment. We had created a comprehensive presentation that would leave no room for doubt about the legal situation. As residents began to arrive, I observed their expressions: curiosity, concern, and in some cases, obvious hostility. Karen Westfield and the other board members arrived as a group, dressed formally as if attending an official function. They took seats in the front row, directly facing the podium where I would speak. Karen's expression was one of smug confidence, clearly believing she still held all the power in this situation. At precisely 7:00 p.m., I stepped up to the podium and surveyed the room. Nearly every resident was present, filling the community center to capacity. A hush fell over the crowd as I adjusted the microphone. "Good evening, neighbors," I began, my voice calm and measured. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I called this meeting to address the serious situation that has developed in our community over the past month. Many of you have witnessed the escalating conflict between myself and the HOA board, culminating in the placement of 5 shipping containers blocking all vehicle access to my property." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some looked confused, while others nodded in acknowledgement. The board members sat stone-faced, watching me intently. For those who do not know me well, I am a real estate investor who purchased the Miller property 3 months ago. What began as a straightforward investment has evolved into something I never anticipated. I gestured to my attorney, who started the presentation. The first slide showed aerial photographs of my property, clearly highlighting the shipping containers blocking the driveway. These containers were placed under cover of darkness by order of the HOA board, specifically directed by Karen Westfield. Security camera footage began to play, showing Karen directing the placement of the containers. This action was taken after weeks of harassment, false violation notices, and intimidation tactics directed not only at me but at innocent tenants of my rental properties. More images appeared: violation notices, photos of board members trespassing, recordings of threatening phone calls. I could see Karen shifting uncomfortably in her seat, whispering to the board member beside her. "But the situation is far more complex than a simple property dispute," I continued. "During my investigation into these actions, I discovered something that changes everything about our relationship." The presentation shifted to property records, corporate filings, and bank statements. When I purchased the Miller property, I also acquired ownership of a holding company called Westview Development, LLC. This company, as the records clearly show, owns all of the properties in the newer section of our community, including the homes currently occupied by every member of the HOA board. Gasps and exclamations erupted throughout the room. Karen's face had drained of color. The other board members looked at each other in confusion and growing alarm. "The homes you believe you own are actually being purchased through lease purchase agreements," I explained, my voice rising slightly to be heard over the growing murmurs. "These agreements make you tenants with an option to buy, not homeowners. Until you exercise that option and complete the purchase, you remain tenants. And as of 3 months ago, I became your landlord." The room erupted in chaos. People stood, shouting questions and demands for clarification. Karen rose to her feet, her face now flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous, a blatant lie. I own my home outright." My attorney stepped forward, carrying folders with individual names labeled on them. "These are copies of the lease purchase agreements signed by each board member, along with bank records showing your monthly payments being deposited into accounts now owned by my client. These are not mortgage payments to a bank. They are rent payments to a landlord." She began distributing the folders to each board member. Karen refused to take hers, backing away as if the folder might burn her. "This is some kind of fraud, some trick," she shouted, but her voice lacked conviction. "There is no fraud here," I said firmly. "Just a legal reality that you were either unaware of or chose to ignore. But that reality has significant consequences, especially given your recent actions." I nodded to my attorney, who distributed another set of documents to the board members. "These are formal notices of lease violations. Each of you has violated multiple terms of your rental agreement by engaging in harassment, trespassing, and interfering with my legitimate use of property I legally own. Under normal circumstances, these violations would result in immediate eviction proceedings. The color had completely drained from Karen's face now. The other board members were reading the documents with expressions of horror and disbelief. The rest of the residents watched in stunned silence. However, I continued, my tone softening slightly, I have no desire to force anyone from their home. That is not why I am here tonight. I am here to restore sanity and mutual respect to our community. I gestured to the back of the room, where a team from the shipping container removal service had quietly entered. As we speak, those containers are being removed from my driveway. The illegal blockade my property is ending, but that is just the beginning. I laid out my vision for the community, a restructured homeowners association with transparent governance, reasonable rules, and respect for property rights. Board members would be democratically elected, financial records would be open to all residents, and the focus would be on enhancing property values through cooperation rather than coercion. The choice before the current board members is simple, I concluded. You can resign your positions, effective immediately, and agree to the terms outlined in the settlement offer included in your folders. If you do so, you may continue to live in your homes under the original terms of your lease purchase agreements, or you can refuse, in which case eviction proceedings will begin tomorrow morning. The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, the sound of heavy machinery could be heard as the shipping containers were being loaded onto flatbed trucks. The symbolic wall between us was literally being dismantled. Karen Westfield stood frozen, the paperwork clutched in her trembling hand, as the full reality of her situation finally sank in. The landlord she had been tormenting was now standing before her, holding her housing security in his hands. The tables had turned completely, and everyone in the room knew it. The weeks following the community meeting brought dramatic changes to our neighborhood. The shipping containers were removed within hours, restoring access to my property. Construction resumed on the main house, and the atmosphere throughout the community underwent a remarkable transformation. Karen Westfield resigned from the HOA board the very next morning, along with all but one of the other board members. The settlement agreements were signed, requiring public apologies and financial restitution for the damages caused by their actions. Within days, Karen had listed her home for sale and began making arrangements to move to another state. I did not object to the sale, despite her technical status as a tenant. Some battles were simply not worth fighting. The restructuring of the homeowners association proceeded smoothly. New board members were elected from among the residents who had shown the most concern for genuine community welfare. The HOA bylaws were completely rewritten, emphasizing transparency, reasonable standards, and respect for property rights. Financial records were audited, revealing years of questionable spending and accounting practices under the previous leadership. Most importantly, clear boundaries were established between HOA authority and private property rights. A professional property management company was hired to handle day-to-day operations, removing the personal agendas and power struggles that had plagued the previous administration. As for my tenants in the rental properties, I offered them new, simplified lease agreements with options to purchase their homes at fair market value. Most accepted gratefully, relieved to have a landlord who communicated clearly and respected their dignity. The harassment and intimidation that had characterized the previous regime became a thing of the past. The main house renovations were completed by the end of summer, transforming it into the comfortable home I had originally envisioned. As a goodwill gesture to the community, I dedicated a portion of my property as a public green space, complete with walking paths and a small playground. Unlike the previous arrangement, this was a formal, legally documented dedication that protected both the community's access and my property rights. One evening, as I sat on my front porch watching neighbors strolling along the new walking paths, Martin from next door stopped by with a bottle of wine. "You know," he said as we shared a glass, "I have lived here for 15 years, and I have never seen this place so peaceful. People are actually talking to each other again, having cookouts, helping with yard work. It is like a completely different neighborhood." I nodded, watching a young family playing frisbee on the green. Sometimes people just need clear boundaries and mutual respect. The problems started when those lines were blurred. Looking back at how the situation unfolded, I realized that the conflict had never really been about property lines or community standards.